This is the story of Cozbi, the woman who could collapse a wall without touching a single stone. She didn't ride into battle. She didn't wield a blade. She used something sharper. Cozbi was the kind of woman who walked into a room without haste, yet left men forgetting what they'd been saying. She didn't need to speak to draw attention. Her stillness did the work. She had been trained for it. Daughter of Zur, a Midianite noble, she was raised in the art of influence. While other girls learned to grind grain or weave cloth, Cozbi learned to read weakness, to study the cracks in a man's resolve and slip a hand inside before he even knew she was there. Her father's words shaped her like a blade. Power doesn't roar, it whispers. That morning, Cozbi made her move. A merchant from the Israelite camp lingered at her stall longer than necessary, his eyes drawn as much to her as to the fabrics. She offered him a private look at rarer silks and led him behind the grain storehouse, out of sight from the market. There, she began asking questions about his people, their leaders, and their laws. He answered without hesitation, eager to impress. Within minutes, she had learned the names of key commanders, the layout of the tribal encampment, and where the guards were weakest at night. The conversation turned. The distance closed, and soon his eagerness to talk was matched by eagerness for her touch. By the time he left, they had crossed more than one boundary, and he had given her enough information to pass to her father by nightfall. It was only one man. But it proved what Cozbi already suspected. Israel's discipline could be broken from within, and pleasure was sharper than any blade. When she first saw Zimri, prince of Simeon, she knew exactly what she had found. He was the kind of man who carried himself like a victory parade, proud stance, clean robe, an air that dared others to keep up. Their first meeting was almost accidental, a casual exchange near the trade stalls. She let him catch her watching him, then looked away just slowly enough to make him follow. A few days later he came to her, not in the noise of the market, but in the quiet blue of night. She waited cross-legged on a woven rug, an oil lamp spilling gold across the room. They talked, but it was not talk that bound them. Her laughter came when his pride needed feeding, her hand brushed his when he reached for wine, and when his guard was lowest she kissed him, not tentative, but claiming. She pressed a carved amulet of Baal into his palm for luck, and he tucked it into his robe without hesitation. From that moment, his steps toward her became bolder. Soon he no longer crept in shadows. He walked to the Midianite quarter in daylight, head high, ignoring the scowls of priests. Men noticed, and when a prince took a Midianite woman without shame, others followed. At first it was a trickle, curious glances, hushed conversations at the market. Then came the late-night disappearances. Israelite men began slipping away from their tents under cover of darkness, drawn to the warmth of foreign fires, the taste of sweet wine, the pull of women who spoke in low, lilting tones and wore colors their own wives would never dare. It was not just lust that crossed the border, it was loyalty. Midianite women placed carved idols in their lovers' hands, whispering blessings to Baal and Ashtoreth, teaching them songs in strange tongues. Some men laughed it off, thinking it harmless to bow once, to burn a pinch of incense. Others began keeping the idols in their tents, hidden at first, then openly displayed. And with each meeting, the line between Israel and Midian blurred. Sacred vows were broken, marriages strained. The camp's once ordered worship began to fracture, the smoke from Yahweh's altar mingling with the smell of foreign sacrifices. Cozbi didn't just win Zimri, she cracked the wall that kept Israel apart. And once the breach was made, the tide of compromise poured through, carrying the nation toward a place from which it could not quietly return. It started small, a cough here, a faint there. By morning, 3 men were dead. At first, the camp whispered of heat stroke or bad water. But by midday, the truth spread faster than the sickness itself. This was no ordinary illness. The air turned heavy with the stench of sweat and fever. Mothers bent over limp children. Warriors who had faced Amalek without flinching now lay shivering in the dust. From the ridge above, Cozbi watched it all. The plague didn't touch her. It didn't even slow her. She sipped water from a clay cup and waited, the gold cuffs on her wrists glinting like tiny suns. In the Israelite camp, panic and prayer collided. Moses stood at the entrance to the tent of meeting, robes torn, voice breaking from calling out to the God who had split seas. Around him, the elders argued, whether to purge the sinners, whether to wait for divine command, whether to do anything at all. And then, Zimri snapped. Zimri strode through the camp with Cozbi's hand locked in his, their steps deliberate, daring anyone to stop them. His robe hung open, exposing the bronze of his chest. Her crimson silk shimmered in the sun, trailing the heavy scent of Midianite oils that cut through the smoke of Israel's altar. They passed the sick and the dead without a pause, the cries of the fevered falling on deaf ears. Elders stopped mid-sentence. Priests froze in the middle of prayer. Mothers turned their children's faces away, shielding them from the sight. Every stride was a public challenge. They moved straight past the altar, past the place where God's presence dwelt, past Moses himself, whose tear-streaked gaze followed them without so much as a glance. This was no secret tryst. This was a message. They did not fear judgment. When they reached his tent, Zimri swept the curtain aside and led Cozbi in. It fell shut behind them, sealing their defiance inside the sacred heart of the camp. The silence that followed lasted only moments before the shouts began, outrage, disbelief, calls for justice. And in the shadows, one man's grip tightened around a spear, his eyes fixed on that tent, his resolve hardening with every breath. He rose without a word, spear in hand, and moved toward Zimri's tent. They looked up as if Phinehas were an intruder at a feast. He did not speak. He stepped forward, lowered the spear, and drove it through them both in a single thrust. The blow pinned them to the ground where they had joined themselves in defiance. The camp outside froze. The Midianite drums stopped mid-beat. Coughing halted. By the time Phinehas stepped back into the sunlight, the wailing had quieted, and the fever's grip had begun to loosen. Runners returned from fetching water to find those they'd left gasping now sitting up. The news spread instantly. The plague has stopped. Phinehas carried the blood-stained spear past the stunned assembly and laid it at the entrance of the tent of meeting. Moses, watching from a distance, bowed his head in relief. The elders stood silent. There was no need to vote, no time for another speech. The judgment had been carried out. That night, the camp was different. The idols were destroyed. Foreign incense was gone. Lamps burned at doorways as families prayed and offered thanks. No one ventured toward the Midianite quarter. The only sound was the crackle of the altar fire, restored to its purpose. At dawn, the count began. 24,000 were dead. The shame was heavy, but the wrath of God had turned away. And in the center of the camp, the spear of Phinehas stood as a witness. Zeal had done what hesitation could not. The morning after the plague ended, the camp moved like a wounded animal, slow, quiet, aching. Ash from the altar still drifted in the breeze, clinging to skin and hair as if to remind them all that fire had passed through this place. The bodies were gathered. Sons carried fathers. Friends carried friends. The tribe of Simeon bore the heaviest weight, their lines thinned, their tents torn down in mourning. Women wept until their voices broke, the sound rolling through the camp like a low wind. Moses walked among them without his staff. There was no need for command now, only the grim work of seeing the dead buried and the living warned. At the edge of the Midianite quarter, the ground was churned black where idols and incense tables had been burned in one great heap. The carved gods lay in fragments, their faces split and unrecognizable. Phinehas stood apart, the blood-washed spear in his hand. He had not sought praise, but it came anyway. Men clasped his shoulder, women bowed their heads in thanks. They knew that if he had hesitated like the rest, the count of the dead would have been far greater. When the graves were covered, Moses called the assembly. His voice was steady, but the air around him was heavy with what they all knew. This could never happen again. He declared the law. No Israelite would take a wife or husband from the pagan nations who lured them to worship foreign gods. The covenant would remain pure, or they would face the same judgment again. Phinehas was given an everlasting priesthood, a covenant of peace from the Lord himself. It was not for gentleness, but for the fierce devotion that turned away God's wrath. The spear was placed at the entrance of the tent of meeting, its bronze head gleaming in the sun, a reminder that zeal for the Lord was not a matter of words, but of action. As the sun dipped behind the hills, the camp began to breathe again. Fires for cooking replaced the funeral pyres. Laughter was hesitant, like a child learning to speak again. But everyone knew the story would be told long after they were gone, how beauty without reverence became a snare, how sin dressed itself in silk and perfume, and how one man's hand stopped the plague when thousands fell. And somewhere in the dust of Midian, the name of Cozbi became a warning,